and Billy's the director of the Alaska University Transportation Center, which works to improve transportation in northern regions. They'll give a brief overview, then we'll open the floor to questions. Visual aids that are on the monitor behind me can be downloaded from the ASSW Press download folders. For those of you joining us via webcast, questions can be asked by clicking on the More Event Details link at the top of the page. We have an administrator monitoring the thread here in the briefing room who will ask your questions. Please make sure you identify yourself and your outlet, please. For those of you here in the room with us, please note that we have a microphone. If you raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you. With that, we'll start the presentation with Billy. Thank you.
Good morning. As the note is, I'm Billy Connor with the Alaska University Transportation Center. I've been involved in engineering and transportation for some 40, 45 years now, and climate change over the years has become a larger and larger part of what we do. I'm an engineer. I'm not a climatologist. And so my comments are really going to be focused on how climate may be impacting our engineered structure, our infrastructure, and what may surprise you is to what it's not doing for us. If you look at the monitor, you see a number of different failures that have occurred that I've taken pictures of throughout my career. One of them is slope failures. Another is over in Canada, the road that we all loved there. All of those occurred, believe it or not, within 2 years. So they're not really climate change. And I think what we need to do is be really careful about how we assign fault or decide whether it's having to do with climate change or not climate change. The one on the lower left, that was settling at 3/4 of an inch an hour, when the one that has the bump there. So I can't really blame that on climate change per se. It's really a part of how we design and build our structures. And if I could have the next slide, please. One of the things that we find is anytime man comes in and disturbs the ground over permafrost, we're going to have problems. It's going to generally start to melt. It's going to start settling. And so we have to take that into account. And so what really causes a problem is trying to separate out the differences between what we cause by simply going in and disturbing the terrain from that is being caused by climate change. And so we really struggle with that. And so the left side of the graph is a study that was done by Dave Esch, actually back in the early 1980s. And we went out and simply cleared the ground. And we took temperature measurements on the surface and measured the settlement. We call it thaw consolidation. So if I throw thaw consolidation in there, it's just simply settlement. But and what we found is in one summer, we were getting on the order of a foot of thaw. We also found that the undisturbed ground in the forest was in July and June, July, and part of August was about 1 degree C plus. When we stripped the ground, that went to 15 degrees C instantly. You can imagine what that's going to occur. And some of the studies that we have showed that over a 10-year period, we might be getting as much as 15 feet of thaw consolidation or settlement under some of our roads. That is too short a period to really blame on climate change. And on the left side there is a graph that we tried to look at the impact of climate change. And what we found is over 100 years, at the worst model that the climate model that we looked at, we were getting on the order of about 3 feet of thaw consolidation over that 100 years. So you can see while we can distinguish the damage done mathematically, in reality it gets kind of lost in the noise, doesn't it? Because we rebuild our roads every 12 to 15 years and complete reconstruction about every 20, 25 years. And so that sort of gets lost while we recognize that. So temperature in and of itself for roadways is not so much of a problem. For buildings, it can be. Another good example is Point Lay. They built their infrastructure out there. They've had 12 feet of settlement out there over the last 25 years, probably more due to what we did than what the climate is. So how do we distinguish that? How do we bring that into our engineering decision process and trying to make that make sense to us? And we as engineers are struggling with that. We're trying to figure out how to bring that into our decision-making process when we start looking at graphs like this. That's not to say that climate change does not have an impact. If I could have the next slide. It does have a number of different problems with it. The melting permafrost can cause slope failures. And climate change, where it might be stable, as it continues to warm, those slopes may get less and less stable and actually ultimately may fail for us. Snowfall events. This year is probably not a good example of that. Although this year is not a bad example of the rainfall events that we see. We're seeing more rainfall events. We see rainfall events in November that are now common. 10, 15 years ago, they were not common. They just simply didn't happen. We're seeing possibility of rainstorms in the middle of January. Didn't used to happen. That throws us in the transportation world into a real tizzy because we're not used to dealing with that. And we're trying to decide, well, is that something that's going to continue? Do we need to gear up to be able to handle it or not? In the Midwest and East Coast, you're seeing a lot of impact due to heavy snowfalls that have not been seen. It seems odd that we're having warming trends, and yet we're seeing snowfalls further and further south each year. People are calling me now to asking how to deal with frost heave that have never had frost heave before. How do you deal with that? How do we predict that? How do we understand that? Forest fires. We're seeing a lot more forest fires, and believe it or not, those have a great impact on our transportation and infrastructure because the vegetation being removed, the water starts to run off, our culverts have to be bigger. In some cases, we get water running under the road, which thaws the permafrost more rapidly. So that's having a big impact, not necessarily due to temperature. Coastal erosion, we're all seeing what's going on there. We're seeing communities that are being moved. In fact, we're working with the Denali Commission right now to assess which communities are at risk due to erosion, flooding, and permafrost degradation, trying to identify those communities which are affected so that we can try to start getting ahead of the game and doing something about that. Let's see, I got one comment about off-ice. Off-ice is where you get the rivers flowing. What shut down the Hall Road last year? We're seeing some increases there, and we're not really sure why and how it all fits together, but we know it's happening, so we're trying to figure out that. We're not really sure whether it has anything to do with climate change or not. There's some evidence that may be, but it's not overwhelming. So, I guess the message that I'm trying to give you is, yes, we recognize that the climate is changing. Yes, we are trying to assess what do we do about it. But in some cases, such as temperature, we're not in a position where we have to do something about it. But in other areas, the secondary flooding and those kinds of things. Oh, by the way, we are seeing glacial streams are getting higher flow, whereas a lot of the other streams are actually decreasing in their flow. So that's causing us a problem. And our colleagues in Fish and Game are really trying to understand that as well, because that may mean we have to change our fish passage criteria under our roadways. So there are a lot of things that are going on here that we don't really understand. We're trying to understand them, and we're trying to get our hands around them. And we're hoping. We are now working with our climatologists to try to understand what their predictions are and try to educate them as to what our needs are. So with that, I'll turn it over.
All right, thank you, Billy. Yeah, if you could go next, Todd, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Todd Brinkman with the Institute of Arctic Biology. My title is wildlife ecologist, but I actually specialize and spend most of my time studying the human dimensions of wildlife science. So that would be human-wildlife interactions and the thoughts, the behaviors, the attitudes of people towards wildlife. And under this kind of human dimensions umbrella, there's all sorts of topics that I think are relevant to rapid social and ecological change that we're seeing. I seem to spend most of my time working in Alaska studying harvest systems, subsistence systems in rural Alaska, some more urban hunting systems, and how climate-driven environmental changes are affecting people's ability to meet their needs, and how they're being required to adapt to some of the changes that we're seeing. Some of the other work I do is with human-wildlife conflict, such as bears on the North Slope, grizzly activity, and oil and gas development. Polar bears spending more time on shore now with sea ice reduction. And then I get as far south as southeast Alaska, where we're looking at kind of the leg effects of a very intensive logging industry and how that's affecting deer and deer hunters down there. So I mainly work with large mammals, but all kind of resources are fair game for me if humans rely on them in some capacity. What might be most relevant for our meeting today that I'll begin with is we're just trying to understand how climate might be impacting subsistence opportunities. We started that in about 2008. So our main overarching goal there was just to figure out how is it impacting and how might people be responding to that. So we took kind of a broad approach, and we looked at the availability of resources in rural Alaska. Now, when I say availability, for a resource to be available to a community, first of all, there has to be sufficient abundance, so there has to be enough to sustain a harvest, right? The distribution of that resource has to be right. So it has to be at the right place at the right time. So we account for seasonal distribution. And the other thing that we began accounting for, and which is, I think, kind of the take-home message here, and it's something that wildlife ecologists never used to spend a lot of time on, and that's people's ability to get to these resources. So accessibility. So we worked with 4 communities for that initial study, and we sat down with many active and experienced harvesters in those communities, and we just asked them what resources are critical to them, and then how are these changes that we're seeing affecting their opportunities to harvest these resources. And what we kind of found was their perceptions were that climate wasn't having a super significant impact on the abundance of the resources that they rely on or the distribution. But what it was having a very big impact on was people's ability to get to those resources, their ability to traverse the landscape. So we identified somewhere around 50 important relationships between climate-driven changes and the availability of resources. 60% of those related to access, and most of those were showing a negative trend over time in that access is becoming more challenging. So some concrete examples might help. So one obvious one is sea ice, the instability, the unpredictable of sea ice for those coastal communities. There's safety issues. There's just kind of a mismatch when they traditionally get out on the ice and when they actually can get out on the ice safely. In the interior communities, Bill mentioned a number of things already that are really important. Hydrology. River navigability is changing rapidly. River channel changes. They're documenting a lot of places where the river's shallower and it's harder to get some of the places that they used to. Forest fires, increase in frequency, severity, extent. After a forest fire occurs, it can damage a lot of these trail systems in rural Alaska. They're really important. So you may think, big deal, trail system, just repair it. Well, if you have toppled trees over miles and miles of extent, it can be a really big issue. It's like blowing up the exit that takes you to your grocery store in an urban area. The difference is DOT might actually be out there the next day starting to repair that bridge. In the rural community, it's up to them to clear those trail systems and get back out there. So with this, that first study, it really highlighted that maybe we're not giving enough attention to climate-related effects on people's ability to access ecosystem services or subsistence resources or wild game or wild fish. So since then, we've kind of shifted our research effort, and we've launched a couple new studies that are really focusing on access. How big of a deal is this? What extent is this occurring over space and time, and how are people adapting to it? So we just started a large study actually under NASA above, Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. And what we're doing is kind of an integrative approach where we're merging citizen science with ecosystem ecology and remote sensing. So let me tell you how this works. We're working with 8 or 9 communities throughout Alaska. What we're doing is going in those communities and getting GPS in the hands of people that are out on the land a lot. And these GPS units have cameras on them. And while they're out on the land, what they're doing is they're documenting these disturbances that are affecting their ability to traverse the landscape. So with their GPS, when they're documenting these areas, they're geotagging them. So we're getting spatial and temporal information. So what we're actually generating through this kind of citizen science effort is this large sample size of very specific disturbances that are influencing people's ability to meet their needs. We then can go out there and kind of assess these sites and better understand the mechanisms that are driving it, whether they're related to climate or something else. And then after, on the ground, we kind of do an ecosystem site assessment. We're using NASA's technology, their satellite and their airborne technology, to see if these disturbances have some unique signature from the air. And say they do, we can quickly kind of extrapolate out, not only across space, but over time, look at imagery from the 1980s, and to see, is what we're seeing now an anomaly, or is this a real trend that we need to look at? And then, of course, the next step, after we begin to quantify these impacts, is to figure out how people are adapting to these changes. How are they responding? Earlier studies, they've already talked about some of the things that they're doing. A lot of them involve technology, switching boats, switching engines, stuff like that. But with changes in technology, especially gas-powered technology, there's other vulnerabilities that we need to consider. Of course, access to affordable fuel. So we kind of are looking at this holistically to see how these changes are affecting human-wildlife interactions and what we can do about it.
We had 2 additional speakers who were scheduled to be here this morning who were unable to make it for a variety of reasons. So thank you both for making this happen this morning. We can open it to questions now. Please wait for the mic if you've got a question here.
Matt Miller from KTO and Juneau. I'll direct my first question to Todd Brinkman here. You may be aware that there was a study that was just published this week in regards to permafrost melting, and specifically the ice wedges that are melting deeper every summer now. And I wonder if you could provide some sort of perspective as far as what that would do to subsistence habitat, as far as the fawning of certain areas, and also, like you mentioned, access to those various resources in those various permafrost polygons. I got some other questions, but I'll save them for later.
Sure. Yeah. There's been some work on the effects of that for a little bit, and they are having an evident impact on subsistence. These ice wedges, especially you said near ponds, did you? Well,
it sounds like some of the effects are ponding around the tops of the ice wedges.
Okay. Yeah, so in some areas, the loss of permafrost underneath results in the draining of some of these lake beds and small ponds and tributaries that may connect main channels to other areas. We're seeing this especially in the Yukon Flats. So areas that they might get off the Yukon River to go hunting or fishing in the past, these areas are drying up. The other thing that you're seeing in these areas that are drying up is shrub expansion. So even if they can move around those areas, the tall shrubs are limiting siteability and kind of their ability just to move through those areas. And also, we're not sure yet, but with regards to some of these river systems that are becoming less navigable, a lot of the hypotheses are thinking it has something to do with changes in permafrost and thermal karst, where you're getting the melting of the river banks and the erosion into these waterways, which can be obstructing travel. But you also mentioned change in habitat, and it can change habitat for some species in negative ways, adding turbidity to the water and stuff like that. With regards to on kind of the terrestrial side of things, there's winners and losers as well. Some of the shrubification that we're seeing in these disturbed areas can be good for herbivores like moose. But anytime a landscape abruptly changes, rather from permafrost changes or from forest fire, these species that depend on kind of older forest may be losers, like your caribou that like a 60 to 80-year-old forest in the winter, because one of their staples is lichen, and that's a species that kind of grows only in a late forest.
Hello, I'm Tim Ellis with KUAC. A question for Billy. Interested to hear that your folks weren't certain whether it's climate related or man-made, the issue of the flooding there along the Hall Road or some stretches there. I'm interested in if you could kind of tell us a bit about whether, if you, what are the man-made causes that may not be related to climate change? Just building a road across tundra. What are the possible man-made or other explanations, if not climate-related, that is causing that flooding along the road there?
I assume you're talking more about the north slope.
Yeah, the Hall Road.
The Hall Road,
yeah.
Towards the north. A number of things have happened as we have constructed, after we constructed that road, and some of them are somewhat subtle. One of the things that we noticed are the ice wedges that create the polygons. If you watch very carefully as you drive there, you'll see every 10 meters or 30 meters or so, you'll see a dip in the roadway, and those are due to the thawing of some of those polygons. And DOT is really good at hiding those by grading and leveling and doing the things that they do, but they are occurring, and they do cost money to repair. So that's one of the things that is happening to us. The other is that's a gravel road, and as a gravel road, it puts off dust, which changes a number of things along the side of the road. It changes the pH of the soil, which changes the vegetation along there, which may or may not be helpful to degradation or to the preservation of the permafrost, depending on which species start to move in there. But it also changes the albedo, which can cause the melt to increase more rapidly. The other thing that can occur is we tend to build the roads up high enough that we don't get drifting on the road, and so we get drifting on one side of the road and not the other, depending on the prevailing winds. And that anytime we get snow piled up, that acts as a really good insulator, which accelerates the thaw of the permafrost and causes the thaw settlement along the roads. And you can see those. You can almost tell which way this wind is blowing in the summertime by the depth of the ditches along the side and a number of ponds that are going along there. And of course, anytime we get ponds along the roadway, that can also cause some degradation of the roadway. So those are all things that we know occur just simply because of the building of the permafrost. When the road was originally designed, it was designed such that the thickness of it would not allow penetration of the active layer into the permafrost, and that was carefully calculated, and they did a really good job of that. But at that point in time, we didn't understand that there was a potential for climate change and warming, and so we didn't account for that. And so we are starting to see a little bit of movement there. But again, because it's occurring over a long period of time, it's really hard for us to quantify that and assign dollars to it. What part of that's just because the road's there, and what part of it is due to the climate change. So that's a struggle for us. And a lot of people want to be able to identify that so that we can go to Congress and say, look, we need more money. And we've been trying to do that, but thus far we haven't been particularly successful in doing so. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and just to quickly clarify, kind of follow-up. So it sounds like you pretty much settled that these are man-made causes, pretty much as far as you know, and now you're just getting indications that maybe there's, in addition to all those factors, perhaps some also climate change influences, or is that just kind of a suspicion or working for you?
Well, we actually started having this discussion about climate change and impacts on our linear highway network mid-'70s when we started seeing the huge rise in temperature at that point in time. And so we started discussing it and trying to get a handle on it. And there were a number of papers presented on the impacts of warming on it, on the roadways, and they weren't as severe as people would have thought they might be. But we recognize. I think it's important. We recognize that it does exist, that the impacts do exist, but the problem is quantifying the cost of that compared to all of the other issues that we're having to deal with, that's where we're struggling. And the other part is, should we be changing our designs? One of the things I didn't say that may be of interest to you, we are doing like insulation and out here in Thompson Drive, the air convection embankments where we pile up the rocks, which is working very well, thermal siphons. We are running some models with some folks in out of Montreal, University of Montreal, and we're seeing that some of these techniques that we are become accustomed to that are working very well for us may cease to work maybe sometime mid-century because of the temperature changes. So now we're looking at, do we put them in and get whatever we can out of them, or do we not put them in and accept the damage in between and go for new technology? That's kind of where we're struggling.
Hi, Gloria Dickey, freelance. I'm wondering if both of you can comment on sort of where your respective research intersects and looking at climate change's impact on things like transportation and human-wildlife conflicts. Are we seeing more issues with sort of roadkill and snow machines between polar bears and grizzly bears, or the need for more wildlife corridors and protected crossings in the future due to migration pattern shifting?
You swing first, or?
You want me to go ahead? Okay. That'd be good.
The intersection between our effort, why, you know, I don't think this was planned, that Bill and I were here together, but it turns out that we are addressing much of the same things, this whole idea of kind of human access across the environment. Help me out again with what your specific question was. You talked about the intersection, or what it means, where our research is going.
More polar bears on shore, for example. Are we seeing more issues with like snow machine conflicts or needs where migration routes might be changing into more human-dense areas, and we're having issues with vehicles and large mammals?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. On the North Slope, there's a bit of research going into this as the kind of the human infrastructure, the roads, the pipelines, as they expand, and there's been research underway on this for a long time of how it might be rerouting caribou migrations or changing distributions of waterfowl or other species that use that in the summer. It is a direction we're going. It's always of interest, and I think what's kind of roadblocked us in the past is we either haven't had sufficient data to answer some of these questions conclusively, or the technology isn't available for us to do it really effectively. But here's one exciting study that has to do with transportation and wildlife and humans. If you go all the way back to the late 70s, early 80s, and you look at some of the tribal resolutions passed by North Slope communities, they have to do with concerns over aircraft activity in important hunting areas. Well, throughout that time, FAA has never really kept track of small aircraft traffic in those areas. And the idea of trying to actually tease out cause and effect relationship between aircraft activity and animal movement is so challenging. It'd be so expensive because you need so much control over that environment, what elevation the planes are flying at, what type of planes are flying, where they're going, that it hasn't been feasible so far. But what we've started to do, and now that the technology is available, is kind of take this backdoor route, in that we now can at least begin to get baseline data on some of like aircraft activity in important caribou hunting areas. And we do this through what they call a soundscape ecology approach, where we're using acoustic devices that are strategically placed on the landscape. And we're not requesting data from anybody, but we're just recording sound. And what we can do based on that sound by looking at the frequency signature is determine if it was a high-flying jet, low-flying prop, helicopter, snow machine whipping by, outboard motor whipping by, jet motor whipping by, whatever. And we can start to get this baseline information so you can think of a spatially explicit sound map. And then what we can do with that is GPS collars that we put out on a lot of wildlife species today that can get fixes, say, every 10 minutes, every 3 hours. And we can get these really fine-scale movement patterns of animals through the environment. By overlapping on top of this kind of spatially explicit soundscape and these animal movements going through, we can start to find if there's some sort of signal. Are animals changing where they're going because of this activity? or others are hunters changing where they're going because of this activity. We know just working with like the community of New Ixet, there may be 1,000 caribou over this hill, but also right over this hill, there's also a lot of other human activity. And just because of the aesthetic value of being out on the land hunting, they may not want to go over there for those easy caribou just because it's not a traditional cultural practice to hunt in that sort of environment. So I think we're on our way as we're getting more spatially and temporally explicit fine-scale data to be able to tease these relationships out really well. So it's getting more and more exciting.
You know, that there is a lot of overlap. Throughout my career, I've worked very closely with Fish and Game and some of the research that they have done. For example, just dust, for example, can change the species along the side of the roadway. And it doesn't necessarily have to be noise. We also know that bears typically don't cross the road when the average daily traffic gets above 500 to 800 vehicles per day. We know those kinds of things. We've done a lot of work in fish passage to understand how our infrastructure affects the movement of fish. So you know, we are working with our colleagues in the habitat arena, and Todd's really doing some really interesting things. I might say also that we are paying more attention to what it's now termed traditional knowledge. As we go into the communities and talk to the people that live in the communities, to get some feedback as to what our infrastructure, what impacts it's having. A good example of that was in Point Lay about 3 weeks ago, and there was a lot of discussion about BLM wanting to come in with helicopters and do some studies on the degradation of permafrost, and they wanted to use the airport at Point Lay as their hubbing point. The community was adamant that not happen. And their view was that the aircraft did not seem to move the caribou around very much. In fact, the caribou were around the airport when we were leaving. And there were several aircraft that had come and gone that day. But the helicopters, they do see, once those things start moving, that the caribou move away very rapidly and get nowhere to be found within the sound of helicopters. For some reason, they don't like the sound of helicopters. So we're paying more attention to that traditional knowledge and listening a lot more to the communities about what they see is happening. We also recognize that there are always going to be conflicts between animals and mankind as we move about the terrain, whether it be by snow machine, dog sled, or vehicle, whatever vehicle we choose. And the greater the number of people moving around, as we might expect, the larger potential for impact, and the larger potential for conflict to happen there. You know, we know that in Alaska there are something on the order of 500 to 600 moose killed a year on our highways, and oddly enough, almost 200 of those are just north of Anchorage. So we do know that those exist. We are working with our colleagues in habitat and biology groups to understand that and try to mitigate that and to add infrastructure to reduce that. We'll never get completely away from it, but at least we can work towards mitigating it.
One more follow-up on your intersection of wildlife and transportation networks, ice roads. We just are on the front end of a neat study to possibly create a win-win-win. Yeah, that's 3 wins between industry, the well-being of bears, and the general public. So before they punch in an ice road on the North Slope to do their winter activity, they search for dens, because if there is any dens, they're required to stay a mile away from a polar bear den and somewhere around a half a mile away from a grizzly bear den. And how they've done this in the past is they use thermal imaging. They equip these to their planes and they fly over these areas that they plan on doing some development. And the idea is that this thermal imaging is able to detect the heat that's emitted from these den bears. They know it can work in some situations, but it's been also kind of ineffective. inconsistent. They don't know really when is the best time to detect bears. So with this recent technology, we've started using unmanned aircraft systems. And what we're doing is actually using those drones to fly over artificial dens to begin with. So these dens that we create that mimic a polar bear or a grizzly bear. So think of like little battery blankets or heaters on the inside that are emitting roughly the same amount of heat that a bear would be. And then we monitor that through the winter as there's different snow thicknesses on top of that den, as the ambient temperature changes, as the wind changes, and we're finding out how detection of something underneath the snow changes under different environmental conditions. And this is going to be really important, because what we can do with this drone is get a lot of different samples under a lot of different conditions to find out what window of time should industry be flying to maximize their opportunity of being able to detect a den. And what we've already found is a day with you got a little bit of sunshine out there, your chances of actually detecting a den is almost impossible, just because of what's created on the surface of the snow because of the sun. So we're already beginning to figure out when they should be focusing their flights to maximize opportunities to detect dens. If they can do this, they can reroute their activities ahead of time, save themselves a pile of money, because if they find a polar bear den after they've already put in this infrastructure, their operations are shut down and they're losing a ton of money every day. If we can find these in advance, we're not only finding out where more dens are as more polar bears spending time on shore, which helps us better understanding the changing ecology, but it's also for the safety of humans working in that area and the safety of that bear during a really vulnerable time, which is when it's in its den. And for polar bears, it's mainly the females, so it's when they're in the den with their cubs.
So Julia Taylor, I'm from UAF and a journalism student, ANS minor. One of the things that I know has been brought up under a number of areas is kind of the changes with having trust lands come into the state of Alaska. And I know that there's already quite a few overlap issues that deal with state lands versus federal lands. Are there things that you see as trust lands also come into the state that are maybe opportunities that aren't necessarily all doom and gloom that you want to share?
I've talked to several of the rural communities that I work with about this issue, and I've got a mixed response. So I don't really have an educated opinion on what this means yet, what the pros and cons might be.
Yeah, I haven't had any real direct experience with it as well. I know they exist, but as far as the impact goes, I don't really have any opinion at this point.
Can you speak to how then just the state, federal impacts work now?
I can speak to it from a wildlife side. I mean,
Right, yeah.
it's a dual management system, which can be really confusing for your hunters on the land, because depending on whether you're on federal or state land, the rules can be very different for what you can harvest, when you can harvest it, and who can harvest it. And I think that most of your hunters across Alaska would like to see a more streamlined process where they're in agreement. At the kind of the more local agency level, the federal and state agencies work really well together. I think it's at the higher levels so that the kids play well. The parents sometimes don't get along, and of course, the parents are making the policies.
Yeah, from a transportation world, you know, we traverse both state and federal lands and tribal lands, and so it gets really, really problematic. The biggest issue that we have is in permitting. The permitting process for each of those lands are totally different, and the agendas of each group are often quite different. And so, you know, it's very difficult to walk through that. And, you know, our permitting people around the state that have to deal with that, I really take my hat off to them to traverse that rocky terrain and working through that and finding agreement. And as I say, the process probably is not so difficult for us. We just accept it and move forward. It's the differences in agenda. We've had situations where one agency is all for it, man, we really need to have that, and then the next one says, no way. And so we get to the boundary, and now we have a whole different set of criteria that we're trying to work our way through. So that's really the biggest issue, is working through the permitting process in there. You know, the land doesn't have boundaries. It just does its thing. But those differences in agendas can really be problematic.
Hello, I'm Maria Nancho from Russia, Russian Academy of Science and Russian Geographical Society. My area of research is now Chukotka Peninsula, which is close to Alaska. So we have a lot of problems related to the climate change and cryosphere response on that. For instance, ice roads that you mentioned. In Chukotka, really, there are no many constructed roads. People can move only by helicopters or in a cold period by these ice roads. But because of climate change, now it's a problem, because the warming is in Chukotka is quite visible, and the ice roads exist lesser time. Also, the second, I think, by importance, the problem for deer husbandry in this region, because of the climate change. And this is a question of accessibility. Snow cover now is covered with some crystallized crust because of the climate warming. And I know some already events that deer cannot have enough food from this crust. And for instance, wild deer even suffer from the hunger sometimes, and even die. So I just want to know your comments, to hear your comments on that. Maybe the same as Alaska, but Alaska, of course, is another different region, but otherwise.
Yeah, embedded in there are a lot of questions, so I'll try to answer the ones that deal with transportation, leave Todd to the remainder. Yes, when it comes to some of the trails, really more than our primary road network, and I think maybe the lower volume roads is what you're referring to. We are having problems with those. In many cases, many of our trails, we wait till freeze up, and then we basically take a snowplow or a drag, really, and create the trails. And we're finding that we're not getting the freeze up until much later in the season, where we used to get it by mid-October. We could start moving on those. Now we're looking at November, and in some cases later, to be able to get those. And we used to be able to get off of them. We wouldn't have to get off of them until April. Now we're looking much shorter, so that season is becoming much shorter, which was usable. Many of our communities have traditionally used rivers as a primary mode of transportation, and that is, we're losing. Todd and I were talking this morning. The loss of life on rivers is increasing. People that are traditionally have done that, falling through the ice, and dying as a result of that. So it's likely that we're going to be faced with trying to use technology to show the thickness of the ice, to try to make that safer, and do a better job of that, instead of just depending on judgment as we are now. So that too is changing. We are seeing the snow crusting a bit more. Which is having not only a problem with the animals, I'll let Todd speak to that, but it's also having problems with movement of snow machines. Anyone that snow machines very much knows, if you get heavy crust and you break through that crust, it's really hard to get back on top of that, and you're dealing with a 500-pound machine trying to put it back on top of that crust and move forward. it really makes it difficult and not very much fun at all. So to deal with. So those are all things that yeah, we are also facing in some of those environments. I think that we just haven't sat down and started looking more carefully at how we may be able to adapt to that. I'm an engineer. I'm optimistic that we can find a solution. The problem is we haven't sought a solution at this point in time, and that takes time, money, and resources to be able to seek out those solutions. And right now, frankly, there's not available.
Okay. Your crusting issue that you're talking about, yeah, I think it's a big deal throughout the circumpolar Arctic. That can be rain on snow events. It can be thaw, refreeze events. And yeah, this crusting is it's an issue for caribou. It's an issue for muskoxen. What we don't know, just like a fire, this crusting, they're not all equal. So certainly there can be a light crusting that maybe a caribou could still get through. So with some of our remote sensing data, we can find out if an area has this crust layer. But what we need to better understand is what severity of this crusting is actually, where's the threshold when these animals are actually inhibited from getting to that forage. And I think that's where a lot of your local observers, you're working with communities, your community-based monitoring, your participatory research, citizen science comes in, where they're out on the land and they can tell us, yeah, it crusted here, but it didn't seem to have effect. But over here, yeah, it's evident that they couldn't get through it, because then we can look at the data and better understand what does it take really to limit these animals' ability to get the nutrients that they need. And Bill's right about the snow machines. That's something that came up. This crusting also not only can get them off trail, but it creates a much bumpier ride, and it can really bang up the snow machines. And the snow machines they made 20 years ago, these little one-cylinders that they could repair themselves, that's not what they're making today. They're making these big electrical beasts that they can't fix themselves. So going out there over rough terrain over a long period of time, banging up your machine results in significant costs. And cash economies aren't that powerful in some of these areas. So if you take costs for repaired snow machines, you're sucking away from something else. So there might be opportunities, to identify these areas that are crusting and inform these communities of when it's occurring and help them know where and when to travel. And that goes back to the river ice thing. These shoulder seasons seem to be getting more and more unpredictable. And that's definitely a dangerous time on these rivers. And I think it's a lot of these safety concerns on the cryosphere that are inhibiting people from getting out on the land and doing what they've traditionally done. So understand where that's occurring, where areas that are more likely for you to have thin ice might occur. These are good areas that we should be focusing our research effort, because I think there's really some applied questions that we can address, but there's also lots of theoretical contributions we can make on the way. I haven't came up with my own really good research question in quite a while, and the reason is because working with communities, they beat me to good questions all the time. And most of the questions that I ask now are derived from conversations with communities and their unique perspectives that they have on change on the land.
Hi, I'm Margie Hobson. I write for a newsletter company on energy, environment, and climate. I've heard a lot about the walrus haulouts during this week, and I'm wondering if either of you have been involved either from a transportation and protection of the animal, the mammals, or whether the human mammal interaction.
I haven't been involved in the walrus issue.
All I can do is repeat what I've heard in the villages and what I've heard from a couple of the wildlife biologists up on the North Slope. We are seeing congregations of walrus where we've never seen them before. And one of the biggest problems that we're seeing is if someone gets in amongst or near the walrus, they tend to stampede. And what that's causing is the loss of their calves. They just simply can't get out of the way, and they're losing a significant number of animals in that. So people want to go out and see them. and take pictures of them, and they're easier to get to in many cases than they have been in the past as a result of where they are, and so that's causing a bit of a problem. Again, going back to my visit out of Point Lay, there's a group of walrus that are hanging around just north of Point Lay, and they are having a real problem with people flying in unannounced and without proper guides and trying to go out and take pictures of these animals and causing stampeding and causing problems. So, you know, that's pretty much the extent of what I know about them, but I do know that that it is an issue, and it's something that the folks, at least on the North Slope Borough, they have their own biologists to look at that issue.
My next question is for Billy Connor, and it's kind of a broad question, sort of oriented to an audience that kind of lives below 60 degrees north. When it comes to those folks, their idea of road construction might be, for example, a layer of aggregate and asphalt on top of that, and maybe building construction, you excavate a pad, and then you pour a concrete foundation. So can you explain how that is different, road building and building construction in the tundra and the permafrost, how that is different, and if you could mention some of those, provide some of the examples of some of those new techniques that you alluded to earlier.
Sure. I've got a great presentation that takes about 3 hours to give on that topic. It is different. And if we go all the way back to Richardson, Captain Richardson, when he was working on the highway, what he observed was that anytime you disturb the vegetation on the land, you most assuredly are guaranteed degradation of the permafrost. And so from that, and we seem to learn this every generation, I'm not sure why, but we have to relearn this. The best thing to do is first not disturb the vegetation, because that vegetative layer does a number of things for you. One, it provides insulation. Two, it acts somewhat like our modern geosynthetics or geotextiles, or some people just call it fabric. It acts like that to kind of hold things together. And it also adds, as the permafrost does melt, which we do expect, it acts as a filter blanket to allow the water to move out of there and help stabilize things. So it does a number of different things for us. So the first thing is we try not to disturb the vegetation. Sometimes we have no choice in cuts, but where we can, we avoid that. The second thing is write your specifications in such a way that you don't encourage the permafrost to melt during the construction phase. And that's why you're starting to see a lot of early winter, late fall, or early winter, late winter construction, so that we keep that permafrost from thawing as we build the roadway. That brings some challenges to us because we can't compact frozen material, so we have to find a way to use fine thawed material. But that brings certainly a challenge to us, but that's something that we typically do. And then we also try to provide as much insulation as we can, either by use of blue board insulation or the thickness of our embankments. But one thing we have to be very careful of, if you're in the warmer permafrost zones, say essentially south of the Yukon River, insulation does not work real well. It's kind of like putting your beer in a cooler. It's going to get hot if you set it out in the sun, but it will not get hot as fast, and that's what insulation does for you. So we typically don't use that. Further north, where we got the mean annual temperatures below freezing, we will often use insulation in that. Sometimes we just simply accept the damage. And that's a conscious decision in each case. We think about that and decide, is it cheaper to build a road so that it doesn't thaw, or is it cheaper just to maintain it? And for low volume rural roads, it's generally cheaper to maintain it. For high volume roads, such as in Fairbanks, Farmers Loop is a good example, where we dug out 20 feet of ice and refilled it. Yeah, because of the traffic levels and the cost of shutting traffic down. So it's more cost effective to do it that way. We also pay a lot of attention to cuts and slopes. Where in the lower 48, you just lay the slopes back at a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 slope on the back slope. We will actually cut it vertical, and we'll cut the trees back from the edge, back 30, 40 feet. And the idea there is that the slopes will melt, the moss will fold over the top of it and insulate it and restore it. We've tried everything, insulation, a lot of different things, and that works really well. When we can't do that, sometimes we'll put rock blankets on top of that to be able to help that. We also are becoming much more adept at using the air convection embankments. They're expensive, but in some cases they are the best choice. DOT is building a new road, realigning the haul road from Livengood 9 miles north, and they're looking at using the air convection embankments to stabilize that road. We're suddenly tossed into a little bit of a tizzy because of the new research that's coming out saying that mid-century they may not work so well, so we're working our way through that. We've also used something called air ducts. Basically, we put a culvert along the side of the road. Whenever you throw the snow on the side of the road, it acts as really good insulation, and it melts, and it causes the longitudinal cracking that you see running up the side of the road. That's what the cause is. And in Farmers Loop, you see the light poles leaning backwards. That's what causes that. But the air ducts, by putting a duct in, an inlet, and an outlet during the wintertime, the cold air goes in there and keeps that frozen. So there's a number of different techniques that are available out there. Guy DeRay is just in the process of publishing a wonderful paper giving all these techniques and advantages and disadvantages of those. So that should be published here within the next few months.
And when you mean insulation, some of them are like the hard foam that you might get at the Home Depot or whatever, you lay that on the roadbed, is that?
Yeah, typically you lay that in layers, 2-inch layers, typically about 4 inches thick. There is another expanded. It's not the stuff you buy at Home Depot, but we can expand it and get the same strength. So we're getting 40 to 80, depending on the material we're using, 40 to 80 psi of compression strength, and we put that down about 3 feet. If we put it too high, we get differential icing, and you hit the insulation, and you'll have ice. If we put it too low, it's not very effective. So we found that 3 feet is about the right place to put it.
What if I want to build something on permafrost? Yeah, what do I do? Do I build it on pilings?
for a structure?
Yes.
There are several techniques. The most common is piling. One of the problems that we have with piling is we have to recognize what our thaw depth is going to be underneath the structure, and as we get warmer, that's going to be thicker and more. And so we have to make sure that we've got embedment of our pile deep enough that we don't get settlement of the structure. Point Lay, they thought 10 feet was deep enough, and what they're finding is they're getting 10 feet of thaw or 12 feet of thaw, and so you see these pilings sitting on cribs that used to be 10 feet in the ground. So we have to project what the thaw is going to be and make sure that as that thaw develops within the life of the structure, that we are still on good footing. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't do that, and as a result. So we have to understand what the first thing you want to do is find out what you're dealing with. You go drill some holes or use geophysical methods or finding out what the ice structure looks like under there. Avoid ice wedges if you can, because they're 100% thaw consolidation. Every foot of thaw you get a foot of settlement, and they don't work real well. So they found that out at Point Lay as well. One of the things that we've done with the North Slope Borough, we've actually gone and showed them how to use geophysical methods to do that ground penetrating radar and OMAPper and a few other techniques. And they now started incorporating that into all of their community planning. So every community is going to get this in the next few years, and they will incorporate that into their planning process. So know what you're dealing with if you're going to deal with permafrost, because not all permafrost is created equal. There's thaw-stable permafrost, which is basically gravel. Thaws, who cares? No problem. There's thaw unstable and ice-rich and ice-poor. Ice-poor, not too much of a problem, but ice-rich permafrost, if you're dealing with that, I tell people to run. Stay away from it if at all possible. Go find another site. If it's ice-poor, we can probably deal with it. The other techniques that we use are active and passive freezing. The thermopiles is on the pipeline is passive freezing. They only work in the winter time, and they will cool the ground, and been very successful at that. Not cheap, but we are able to do it. If we go to up to Slope Mountain maintenance camp in Galbraith, they have active freezing underneath them. They actually have refrigerators that freeze the ground. So that's what they've chosen to do. In fact, the fire and rescue building at Barrow, which I was the project manager for, it has active freezing to keep it frozen. Another technique is what we call pan duct. Basically, I told you about the air ducts under roadways. We do the same thing under buildings. We put these duct systems under there that we open up in the winter and force air through it to freeze it, refreeze it. So there are a large number of techniques that are available to us depending on the site-specific requirements and the requirements of the structure. So hire a good engineer.
How does the passive freezing method work? What's the procedure in that?
Basically what you have is a tube that's filled with a gas, and that can be anywhere from ammonia to propane to other gases, and they're at such a pressure that at the temperature of the permafrost, it's liquid. No, I'm sorry, it's gas. At the permafrost, it's gas, and so the liquid that we put in there is liquid, and we put it in the ground, and the heat of the ground turns it to gas. That goes up to the top of the tube, and if the temperature is cold enough, typically below 0 or so, it will, well, actually below 0 Fahrenheit, it will then turn it back to liquid and trickle down to the bottom. So it's a two-phase cycle between gas and liquid. It circulates through and then extracts the heat out of the ground, and it only works in the winter. During the summertime, it's completely dead. Nothing is going on, so only in the winter. So when I said that some of the techniques we have as the climate warms, they may not work. If we don't get a cold enough temperature in the winter long enough, then we won't extract enough heat out of the ground to stabilize the ground.
And then the cold exchange doesn't work down below.
It doesn't,
Yeah.
right. It doesn't reverse itself. It only goes one direction.
All right, is that all our questions here?
Sorry, one last question. Are there programs specifically for middle school or high school kids that you would really suggest that, sorry, for communities that, want to have young people involved in addressing these kinds of issues for their communities, ways for them to get involved, or programs that are specifically designed to make sure that local populations' kids are involved?
We don't have a formal program, but one of the things that we try to do is every time we go visit a village and school's in session, we make it a point to go to the school and we talk to the science teacher, and we talk to the kids about what's going on around their community. We always try to tailor it to what's going on around them, because that's their world, and try to explain something that's going on outside of that world is not particularly meaningful. So we do try to do that. In some cases, the science teachers follow up with us, and we provide training materials and assistance in developing curriculum for that. But one of the things that I'm trying to get going, and I haven't had too much success at it because it's summertime and professors want to do something else, but to have a train the teacher program, and I'd really like to get that going. The idea is to bring the teacher in and teach them how to teach either engineering or science in their program as it relates to either climate change or some other portion, but to teach them how to put together. And other universities have done this and had really good success at that, but it does require that we do this during the summer sessions in there. So it's something we'd like to do, but we have not done.
Same with us. We try to get the local schools involved, but most of the time it's my colleagues that kind of specialize in outreach to K through 12 that I work through them and launch their programs. I can certainly get you in touch with those folks. I know they're doing some really interesting things. Like I mentioned the GPS project that we're working on, and through one of their programs with the school, the students actually downloaded the data from the GPS units and created story maps. And then the hunters came in and described these images, so it allowed communication between the hunters on what they're doing with the GPS units, and then building the GIS, the technical skills to kind of put those images on a map and display them. And I think that was called Map Teach, but that may have evolved.
Right. Thank you both, and thanks everyone for your questions. If you have follow-up questions, you can please feel free to email them to Marmion Grimes. Her address is on the main conference media page at assw2016.org/news/media. Thanks, everyone.